This is part one of the squashed glass class that I'm offering. Today we're going to be looking at the kiln shelf and why preparing that kiln shelf is important to the outcome of the project. The kiln shelf and preparing, we may think that that's just a small part of the process, but it's really the foundation part of the process, because from the kiln shelf you build up. So the kiln shelf preparation adds texture to the shelf. So depending on how you want to use that texture on your piece determines how you're going to treat that kiln shelf. The way I do it, right now you can see that I'm scraping the shelves and preparing the shelf. I'm getting rid of all the old kiln shelf that's on there. I do this every time before I start a new piece that I put on for the kiln. I use a scraper and then I go back through and I use sandpaper. When you do a squashed item, there's some residue that's left behind from the glass, and it discolors that kiln shelf wash. And if you don't get all that off, then the next piece that you put on there to squash picks up that residue and that color and actually fuses that into the new piece that you have on the kiln shelf. So I scrape it and then I go back through and I sand everything. I got started with this technique about 4 years ago, where I wanted to try something new. And the question that I had at that point 5 years ago was, how do I put texture on the bottom side and the top side of my piece without sandblasting and without etching? At that time, I did not want to do sandblasting. I thought it just gave the piece a two-dimensional feeling, and I wanted more depth and a more of a three-dimensional feeling in the piece. The same way with the acid etch. It just gave it a two-dimensional feeling. I didn't like that. So I started experimenting with things, and I have a test kiln, an 8-inch Paragon, and I do a lot of testing with that kiln. So what I did was I thought, well, the bottom I like, the top I don't, so let's put another bottom on the top. And I did that, put some weight on it to flatten it out or to keep it flat, and it turned out exactly what I wanted. So 4 years I started working on that process, and I've been continuing to do that over the last 4 years. A test kiln can be very good to have. 5 years ago, I really became interested in Bullseye's reactive glasses. So with a test kiln, I made up 2-inch squares of a lot of different types of glass, and I could then put 4 2-inch squares in the kiln and start testing to see what reactions different types of Bullseye glass has. And I did this for a year. I worked an entire year just with the 8-inch kiln, doing 2-inch square test squares. Of course, at the end of that year, I had hundreds of test squares, but it really got me aware, it really made me aware of what types of reactions happen with the different types of reactive glasses that Bullseye made. So the thing is, you know, with glass and with life and art in general, you never know what is enough unless you know what is more than enough. So working with all the reactives, putting weight on a piece of glass as it's firing to see what happens, we're going beyond. We're going beyond what is normal and reaching for something else. And we don't know what that something else is until we come to the end, until we've reached enough. So that's kind of what I've been doing on. And luckily for me, by going too far, I stumbled into something a little bit different than what I was doing and what other people were doing with glass. And it's just been great. I had a photography teacher back many years ago, and he taught me two different things. One thing is, when you're photographing and you think of something, then try it. So in our class, this was in college, the teacher would do evaluations of the images that we made the previous week, and we had to at least turn in 5 images every week. And if we would be talking about our images, and if we said, well, I thought about trying this, but I didn't. He had a big old rubber stamp, and he would take our print down that we were talking about, and it was an ink stamp, and he would stamp it with the words, try it. So that's always stuck with me. If I think about something, then I remember that rubber stamp, and I just stamp it, and I try it. The other thing that he would say from time to time is assume you are in the wrong place. Assume you are in the wrong place. With photography, that makes sense because sometimes if you move a little bit to one side or you move up or you move down, you can get a totally different photograph. And a lot of times they're a lot better photograph. But it also works with me, with my artwork. I always assume that I'm in the wrong place. That maybe if I use a little bit different glass, maybe if I try a little bit different technique, maybe if I move some things around, things may turn out a lot better. So those are the two things that have kind of helped me when I think about the types of things that I do. So as you can see from the video, and I'm doing a voiceover here on the video because some of this stuff can get pretty tedious, and it gives me a chance to explain a little bit during this opening part 1 session about kind of the overall picture of what I'm doing here. But you can see here I'm using the Bullseye Shelf Primer, and I'm rolling on the shelf primer with a roller, just with a sponge roller. The thicker you put it on, the more texture you will have on the piece that you're squashing. And you can also use texture in a lot of different ways. You can put marks on the boards and use it in that way as well. Let me talk about a little bit more about the texture. You can apply the texture, the kiln primer, onto the shelf with a sponge, and you can use that wetted sponge then to start filling in the spaces in that kiln shelf. You can also use a comb or a rake, and I've done that in the past, where you make marks with a comb and a rake on the surface of the shelf before the kiln primer dries. So there's a lot of random marks you can make. The sky's the limit. This is just to give you a starting place to start thinking about what kind of marks can I put on this shelf and where are these going. Let me talk a little bit about the size of the shelves. I have several GL24 Paragon kilns, and the inside measurements are 24 by 24. The main kiln shelf is 21.5 by 21.5. That shelf sits on the bottom. On top of that, then, I use my 2 squished glass shelves, and they're 20-inch shelves. They are made by Bullseye. I get them from Bullseye. So that's primarily what I use for that shelf.